when I came into the auditorium this evening and started walking toward the front, the display with for our preacher Dale Jenkins was on there with the socks. I guess implying that with exciting socks like this, you're going to get an exciting lesson. And the only thing I could think of was, sorry, you got plain black socks tonight. So hopefully I can overcome that. It'll still be interesting for you. I want you to think of a scenario. What if tonight you heard a lot of noise outside, and all of a sudden some soldiers came storming in here, and they were Russian soldiers. They had taken over the country, the state. Some of you that are old enough may remember that movie, I think it was Red Dawn or something from years ago. That played out. And so they said, sorry, you're not living here anymore. We're carrying you back to Moscow. Carried you back to Moscow, and they pretty much let you know right up front, you're not Americans anymore, you're Russians. You're going to learn Russian, you're going to eat like a Russian, you're going to talk like a Russian, you're going to live like a Russian, you're going to do things you are no longer an American. What would your reaction be? I guess especially using Russia and those of us from the Cold War day, we start bristling. No, you're not going to do that to us. I'll always be an American. Well, in essence, that's what happened to the Jews when Babylon came, ransacked Jerusalem. They took the Jews off to exile into Babylon. And they, took people like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they basically said, nope, you're not Jews anymore. We're going to turn you in to Babylonians. You're going to eat like us. You're going to talk like us. You're going to learn what we have to say. You're not Jews anymore. They were in exile. What would they do? Would they remain loyal to God during this time of being in exile? In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11, Peter says, I urge you as sojourners and exiles. So it's interesting today, Peter calls us as Christians, we are also exiles. We may think of exiles as the Jews in Babylon, or we may think of even Abraham as a sojourner in the land of Canaan, or in Egypt, the Jews. But we're also called exiles, sojourners and exiles. As Christians, the world wants to mold us into its shape. The world wants us to conform. It wants us to talk like the world, think like the world, act like the world. The world does not want us to be identifiable as Christians, just as the Babylonians. They didn't want anything for the Jews. We don't want you to be identified as a Jew. We want to turn you into a Babylonian so you're not recognizable as a Jew. We live in a world that would like to do that to us today. So how can we be faithful to God while we're living in exile? How should we react? It seems like I think about these things, especially, this is our favorite time of year, election time. Doesn't everybody just, look forward to this every 4 years? And maybe when things get really political, I think about this more often than not. Well, how am I supposed to act as a Christian? Yes, I've got my civic duty, but can I go too far? Would I do this or that? How do I live as a Christian in exile, which is what we are? We see examples I mentioned like Daniel, Meshach, Shadrach, Abednego, Esther, and Mordecai. There's different examples we have in the Bible. So I don't know who created this phrase. I admit freely up front, I'm stealing the framework for this. I can't remember where I read it. But it's been described that the people, the Jews, were living according to what some call the exile ethic. How do we live as exiles? And what I want to do tonight is think about, all right, how did the Jews live by this exile ethic? And then how does that apply to us? What can we learn from the way the Jews lived, or not just the Jews, but others in exile, as we think about living in exile today? Well, the first point as we look at them in exile, they worked hard serving their captors without sedition. They were hard workers. They served their captors. They didn't try to overthrow them. If you have your Bibles, turn to Jeremiah chapter 29. It's interesting. We're going to read a few verses here from Jeremiah chapter 29, beginning in verse 1. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. It says, "These are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders of the exiles, and to the priests, the prophets, and all the people, whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was after King Jeconiah and the queen mother, the eunuchs, the officials of Judah and Jerusalem, the craftsmen and the metalworkers had departed from Jerusalem. The letter was sent by the hand of Elasah, the son of Shaphan, and Gemariah, the son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to Babylon to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. It said," this is the words of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah to the Jews that have been taken into exile. Verse 4, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, take wives and have sons and daughters, take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters, multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare you will find your welfare." You know, we should do the same thing. As Christians in exile, we live in the society. We live, we work, we have families, we build houses. We should feel free, and we should take it upon ourselves to live as we're supposed to in the world that we're in exile. But you think about, as we do that, as God said through Jeremiah, pray for the well-being of the cities that you live in. That's our responsibility. There may be a lot of things in this world that we don't like, but our prayer should be for the cities and the states and the nation that we live in. As he says here, for in its welfare you will find welfare. We need to pray for our leaders. You think of Mordecai and Esther. Here, Mordecai, they were in a strange land. And what did Mordecai, when he heard about a plot to assassinate the king, what did he do? He could have said, well, good for him. He deserves it. Look what he's done to us. We're living here in exile. No, he looked after the best of the king. He reported an assassination attempt. When we look at 1 Peter 2:11, when he said, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh that wage war against the soul." After he calls Christians exiles, look at verse 13. So after he calls us exiles, then he continues on in how we are to act as a sojourner and exile. He said, "I urge you as sojourners and exiles." Now I'm going to tell you how you should act as a sojourner in exile. Beginning in verse 13, he says, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to the governors as seen by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." Isn't that in essence the same thing the Jews did when they were living in Babylon? They were supposed to honor the expectation that God told them through Jeremiah. Look at the leaders, pray for the cities where you are. Live as you should. Go about your business, but be responsible citizens. It's interesting, Jesus did the same thing as oftentimes they tried to get Jesus to go against the Romans. The Jews weren't in exile per se at that point in terms of they were living in their own land, but they were in some ways in exile because they were living under the Romans, under the rule of a foreign power. That Jesus called upon them to overthrow that power. Many times the Pharisees, they tried to trick him into saying things that would be against Caesar, against the Romans. What did Jesus do? He told them, hey, be good citizens. Give honor to an honor. where it's due. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, to God the things that are God. You know, our role is not to subvert the government in a direct way, but is to live as Christians. But you know what? When we live as Christians, we do, subvert may be too strong of a word, but when we live as Christians, we do impact our government. We impact our cities. That is our role, is to live as Christians in this land that we were in exile. Let's look at the second point. They were above reproach. Even their worst enemies struggled to find fault with them. We see this especially in the case of Daniel, maybe the most famous example of this. In Daniel chapter 6, verses 4 and 5, as Daniel has been placed in a high position, the king had created what we call satraps, a group of 120 leaders of the land. And he put 3 people over those 120 as the most powerful people in the land. And Daniel is one of those. And the others are jealous of him because they know that the eye is toward the king of putting Daniel in charge of everybody. So they said, we've got to get rid of Daniel. We've got to get him out of the way. And what does verses 4 and 5 of Daniel chapter 6 say? It says, Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel, unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. Daniel, as he's living, think about that, how tough that would be. You're a Jew, you're very intelligent, you have a fondness for your Jewish nation. You long for the day of going back to Jerusalem, but you're living in a foreign land. The temptation to compromise, the temptation to do things to self-perseverance. And yet, the people that are looking for something to find wrong with him, they can't find anything. What an example that is to us, that we're called in the same way. Look at Joseph. Joseph had been sold into Egypt. Look at how his conduct was so strong it actually caused some of his problem in terms that he wouldn't give in to temptation. But that living in the way that he should be, that was responsible for him, was part of his living in exile. And it is the same with us. Again, as Peter mentioned in chapter 2, verse 11, calling us sojourners in exile. Look at verse 12. Again, you're in exile. How should you react? Because I urge you as exiles, verse 12, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Our conduct as exiles in this world has to be above reproach. If we're going to impact, if we're going to influence this world, if we're going to live as we should as exiles, our conduct has to be above reproach, so that we may have enemies, we will have enemies, but like Daniel's enemies, they had to find a fault in his God or in his obedience to God, or they had to make up something, as we see in other situations. Third thing of the exile ethic. They were respectful and submissive to the rulers over them. You know, this has to be one of the toughest things to do. I mean, because when you think about our rulers, I mean, it's just when you think about Congress, you think about Senate, think about everybody in power in this country, and they're just the epitome of virtue and admiration. This is an easy thing to do, right? We struggle. We see the things that our leaders do that are self-serving, things that aren't right, things that contradict the laws of God, the will of God. We see pettiness and hypocrisy, and could go on and on. But what are we told? What did the Jews do? As in the case of Mordecai, he actually saved the life of the king. Part of being above reproach is praying for our leaders and being submissive to our rulers. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and the first 2 verses of 2 Timothy 2, Paul says, First of all, then I urge that supplication, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. Submission to authority, praying for authorities is an expectation that we have as Christians. Romans chapter 13 says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. There is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. You know, it's interesting, the Jews in exile, those who were faithful, those who knew what was going on, knew that they were in Babylon based on God's will. So even though they didn't like the king, people like Daniel realized this is part of God's plan. I need to be submissive because the authorities are here because of God. It's part of God's plan. As we may not like our rulers, we may not like those in authority, but we still need to pray for them. We still need to be respectful to them. We still need to pray for the best for them, especially as it regards to following God's will. Now we get to the howevers. All those things that were done by those in exile. It says, however, their true loyalty was to God, and they would often disobey the laws of Babylon or Persia or whichever location in order to be loyal to their covenant with God. So while they were not being subversive, while they were doing their best conduct, while they were praying and seeking the best for the cities they were in, they were doing that because of their true loyalty to God. And they would disobey those laws. If it came down to a choice between obeying the law of God and obeying the law of man, they would obey the law of God. Again, we see that in Daniel, the case of Daniel in the lion's den, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. We see that with Esther. We see that in Acts chapter 4, when they're called, Peter and John are called before the rulers. Peter and John answered them, Acts chapter 4, verse 19, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge, for we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard. We need to obey God rather than men. This was a part of the exile ethic. As they lived in this strange land, as they were trying to be turned, all right, I'm going to be obedient, I'm going to be submissive, except when it comes to disobeying God. And as part of that, they accepted the penalty for their disobedience, even if it was death, because they trusted in God. You know, to me, some of the most powerful passages about faith in the Bible are people living out number 5. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So, you almost get chills, or at least I do. Almost get chills every time I read this, no matter how many times I've read it. Daniel chapter 3, beginning in verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. After they'd been told to bow, and they said, he had told them, if you don't bow, you're going to be thrown into the furnace. He said, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, even if God decides not to save us, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. They made the decision, even if it means death. I'm not going to obey man. I'm not going to compromise when I'm put my obligations to God for men. To me, that's just so powerful. Another example, Esther. In Esther chapter 4, verse 16, when Mordecai, after he has talked to Esther and said, you have to go before the king. And she says, all right, if I'm not invited, I go before the king, there's a chance of being put to death. She said, okay, I'm going to do that anyway. She said, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. I will go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish. That's the exile ethic. We're going to obey God, even if it means we perish, as the example we get from Esther. Remember Paul, when he was giving his defense as someone's right, he says, if I've done something worthy of being put to death, then I don't mind being put to death. Now, in his case, obviously, he hadn't, but he's saying, look, if I deserve death, then so be it. We need to have the same attitude as we think about our life in exile on this earth. I asked Paul to sing this song before the sermon. This is one of my, probably don't have a single favorite song, but in my short list of favorite songs, this is one of them. This world is not my home. And this is about this exile ethic. It's about knowing that this world is not our home. One of the things that I'm sure gave the Jews the strength of living and during the time in Babylon is knowing this isn't home. At some point, I'm going home, but this isn't it. That should be our attitude as well. That is part of the exile ethic. Jesus made it clear in John 8, he said, you are from beneath, I am from above. You are of this world, I am not of this world. Jesus set that example for us. In the prayer before the garden, as he's praying for the apostles, he's saying, Lord, they have to be in the world, but I pray that they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Do we understand this? As we live in this land of exile, do we understand that we are not of this world? And there's so many benefits to understanding this. This life has a lot of disappointments, a lot of struggles, a lot of pains. People are in mourning now over loss of loved ones. And there's a lot of, if this world is what it's about, then there's nothing, what comfort can we have? Basically, we live, we die, and that's it. What kind of comfort can we have from this world? But if this world is not our home, then we realize we haven't lost anything. One of the saddest verses in the Bible to me is in 2 Timothy 4:10, when the brief words related to Demas, where he said, Demas has forsaken me, having departed to he loved this world. In essence, he gave up. He didn't want to be in exile anymore. He wanted to be part of the world. And how sad that is. When you compare that to Abraham, it was said of Abraham, he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. You have to have Paul at the end of his life saying, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and not only to all those who loved his appearing. If this world was Paul's home, he couldn't have said that. If this world was Abraham's home, he could not have said what he said. If we go back to Jeremiah 29, we read of what God said to the exiles at the beginning. He said, you need to live in this land. You need to pray for it. You need to seek the good of that land, because that is where you're going to be. If we read a few verses later, Jeremiah 29, beginning in verse 10, after he had said, live in the land, have families, go about your daily lives, pray for the good of this city, he said, for thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you, and I will fulfill to you my promise, and bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. He said, all right, you can live in exile because you know what? I'm going to come back for you. You will have better days. And just like the Jews in Babylon, God has promised to return us from exile. He told Jews, you're going to be in another land for a while, but after 70 years, you're going to come back. You're going to come home. Look what Jesus said in John chapter 14, beginning in verse 1. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself. And where I am, you may be also. Just as God made the promise to the Jews, I'm coming back, I'm going to return, you won't be in exile forever. As Christians, we're living in exile, but Jesus has made the promise, I'll be back, and then I'm taking you home. And it's because of that that we can live as we should. And we need to concentrate and remember that this world is not our home, because we can trust that God will return us from exile when he comes again. This world has a lot of struggles in it, but I think as one of the things that reason again why I like that song, this world is not my home. I need to realize I live in this world, build houses, just build a new house. So have families, grandkids, all these things. Seek the good for these things. But that's not where my hope is. I'm still in exile, and I'm looking forward to the day when he comes back. Are you ready for that time when Jesus will come to return us from exile? If you're not prepared, then you will not be with God, not be with Jesus. You'll remain exiled from God. If you have any needs tonight, I invite you to come as we stand and sing.